The Zarlum Chronicles, Episode 2, Part 5. The Zerm race were actually beginning to become more of a society that would bring them all closer together. There were so many of them in the tribes that it was difficult to sometimes properly give them jobs and give them things for society because of how many there were. To fix that little issue, they started diversifying into different society groups, such as when money was introduced into society, the people with the most and the people who did the most were put into their own groups, and people who made less also went into their group. However, after a few years, it became obvious it wasn't enough, which was why new forms of belief were put into groups, and that's how religion started spreading further and further, pulling more people together or apart. One of these religions was started by a man known as Zenith. He had a belief in magic, believing it to have a science to it which he could unlock and control. He started a group known as the Monks of the Fallen Moon. One of their core beliefs was that the moon had an ancient artifact that gave Zarlum its strange, unique qualities. They also believed a god was buried in the middle of Zarlum, which was almost correct. They just got the wrong place. However, this knowledge and belief caused them to become the biggest and most dangerous religion on the entire of Zarlum. Many people thought Zenith was insane with his theories until he managed to cheat death, living for hundreds upon hundreds of years. People would try to assassinate him and would always fail. After a few hundred years, a few cities had been created around the globe. However, the first megacity was created, called York, with 2 million Zerms all living and working together for a time. It was an enormously advanced city compared to everywhere else. It had proper stone roads, horse and carriages, and even more amazingly, a plumbing system. They were past the time of throwing their leftovers out the windows and making the streets smell horrific. Society was also changing. Before, every job that was done was for survival, like farming, hunting, and other things like that. However, with 2 million of them, they didn't need that many hunters and gatherers. In fact, in a city, they didn't really need any at all. They would get all of their food from farming villages around the city. So what were the people in the city meant to do for a living? Some people went into clothes making. Some went into jobs to help the city, such as builders or other jobs which kept the city running. Some people went into entertainment because the days of survival were over. Now, it was the time to start enjoying their lives. Obviously, they didn't have movies and TV. However, they had something pretty close. Plays. Huge stages were made for the plays, and the first celebrities were coming around. It wasn't just the actors, but the writers were being seen as famous. However, the plays were very expensive, and a lot of people couldn't afford to go to the plays, so they had other options, such as sports like football and other sports seen today. Many people went to watch these games of a bunch of people kicking what is effectively a bag of air around into a fishing net, and somehow that is still watched thousands of years later. The world is a strange place. A few people went into other forms of entertainment, in the form of brothels, and other buildings were open, and that's all I'll say about them, because I think you got the idea. The city did have its problems. Hundreds of people lived in villages, and hearing of the new cities were tempting to them, so they started moving to the city. However, the city wasn't big enough for that. They tried to grow it bigger and bigger, renaming it to New York. And it was almost 8 times the size of Earth's New York. And it just kept getting bigger, right in the center of the mainland. The Zerms realized they needed another city, so they created another, and then another. And after that, they never stopped. Almost everywhere was populated by the Zerms, in either farming villages or cities, taking over the mainland as the most intelligent beings on the entire planet. And unlike the dinosaurs, they were not going to be wiped out. God wasn't allowed to make a clean slate and start again on a new blank canvas again. Not yet, anyway. The Zerms were free to never stop growing and expanding. When the cities were made, they had to start governments for each one, all doing it in various interesting and sometimes horrible ways. Sometimes with votes, and other times, they just took control forcefully. The monks of the fallen moon had risen to be enormously powerful. The concept of their magic wasn't even a concept anymore. It was horribly real. The monks went to New York knowing it was the center point for the entire planet. After a large battle between the monks and the government of New York, the monks managed to win with the monks' magic. The New York government didn't stand a chance. When the monks were in charge, they created the Great and Bountiful Zarlum Empire, far bigger than any empire Zarlum would ever have again, or any empire that people would know about. The reason the monks named their empire the Great and Bountiful Empire was mainly because they wanted their enemies to fear how big the empire actually was, despite the fact they wouldn't have that effect. But we'll get into what happened to it soon enough. With the monks having one city they wanted, all of them, so they went from city to city growing their power more and more, making slowly infecting the planet almost easy. With the addition of new cities, along came the slow evolution of technology. One of the most significant moments was when inventors worked together to create what they called air docking stations, because they built new forms of travel being enormous airships like blimps. However, they were made to be more safe and travel very quickly. While they were flying around the ocean, mapping and exploring new lands, they started noticing the islands littering the planet, which they had no idea about before. They were bigger than normal islands would be and seemed to be very livable, being similar distances apart from each other. With the new discoveries of the islands, they decided they would need to go to them because Zarlum was beginning to fill up with the Zerms. So they needed more space, and the islands were perfect. They started building fishing docks, then started making large cargo ships made of wood. They had to build them with sails, making them like pirate ships, but a lot bigger. They were longer, capable of lifting enormous shipments of cargo. The people went out into the ocean, terrified they would fall off the world because they believed it was flat. However, it was actually them going out and discovering different things, for them to learn the world was indeed round, which they learned very quickly with math, logic, and common sense. While they were out in the ocean, they discovered thousands of islands. A lot of them were inhabited by other types of Zerms, like tree Zerms and water Zerms, so they were left alone in peace because the Zerms were very nice like that. They did discover a lot of other islands that were empty, and people began to live and ship between the islands and the mainland because the islands had a lot of materials the mainland did not, such as metals and even foods like bananas and pineapples. So they were moved to the mainland, and Zarlum was moving happily. After a few hundred years of Zarlum continuing to improve, they began to notice 12 much larger islands around the mainland, almost perfectly going around it, at similar distances away, going in a half circle around the mainland. In the future, they would discover that the islands were actually connected to the mainland. The rocks went deep under the ocean, then across, connecting to the bottom of the mainland, and they were created millions of years before, when the asteroid came down. It landed nearby, and the resulting Zarlum quake caused a huge crack to open up, splitting the mainland. This resulted in the eventual formation of the 12 islands. When they were first discovered, they were turned into main shipping sites. However, the mainland were building their own megadocks, making the 12 islands almost void. So they needed a new purpose. People decided to turn them into giant island cities. However, to do that, they needed to first have a way to get to them, resulting in the formation of large wooden bridges going from the mainland to them. People were greatly interested in the island cities due to the fact a lot of rare and important materials were underneath them. Many scientists started setting themselves up on the island cities. It was also a sort of beacon to many people that the island cities were definitely the places to live. This would result in the 12 island cities being very culturally significant to the people of Zarlum. However, these cities were advertised as the perfect places to live, but in reality, they did have their problems. However, it was the same problem as every other island. With this new venture making cities out on the ocean and the new shipping superhighways, resulted in a new, horrible job to emerge. Pirates. A large amount of pirates started roaming the ocean, taking down cargo and fishing boats, robbing them, and some would even kill the crew, dumping them into the water. And if they weren't killed in some cases, they wished they would have been, for in some cases the pirates would kidnap them and traffic them to the highest bidder. The pirates were extremely dangerous because the monks were the powerhouse of magic on Zarlum. However, the pirates also had their own magic. Some controlled the magic, but others would be cursed. There were many naturally occurring cursed objects out there, and sometimes pirates would find them. Some were good curses, and others weren't. With the pirates emerging, the people had to do something. However, every time they tried, the pirates would come back even worse than before. That resulted in the Zerm starting to implement new laws and hiring people to enforce them. The laws were all wrote down and had to be followed, or they would go to jails or, most likely, be executed for their crimes. That surprisingly worked with a lot of criminals, and order was formed. However, this did not work with the pirates, because it turned out the pirates were fully aware what they were doing was illegal. They simply just didn't care. So they would continue doing what they were doing without any caring for the law. The problem was, somewhere out in the ocean was a large island that was a pirate stronghold. It was incredibly fortified and had enough supplies and weapons to allow them to be secured for 80 years. There were thousands of pirate ships there. The government of one of the island cities sent 50 boats to where they believed it was, and they were never heard from again. No one knew what happened. Some believed pirates killed them. Others believed the dangers of the ocean claimed them. The pirates have never confirmed nor denied them sinking the ships. But to be fair, they're pirates. The issue with the island was, it wasn't really findable. The entire island had a curse. Anyone who stepped foot on it had to be a pirate. And they knew where it was. They knew how to get there. But the curse would not allow people who were not pirates to the island. They couldn't even talk about where it was or what it was called. So no amount of interrogation would bring the information out of people. Pirates were incredibly difficult to fight, however. They did have weaknesses. The oceans of Zarlum were a very dangerous place. There were enormously dangerous creatures in the ocean. The Kraken isn't a legend on Zarlum. It's a real creature, and enjoyed bringing down ships. Mostly pirate ships. It seemed to like the idea of employing justice. There were also giant sharks, enormous, dangerous fish. However, pirates understood those weaknesses, but the risk was enormously worth it. If there was a pirate who wasn't rich, they were doing something enormously wrong. So those weaknesses were acceptable to them, and possibly fightable to them. However, there was one weakness that the pirates had, and always would have, because it was part of their core nature, something they simply couldn't control. The problem was, pirates were incredibly selfish. They constantly fought each other. There were hundreds upon hundreds of pirate wars fought throughout the ocean, always killing each other for their treasure. To hopefully fight against this, the pirates would bury their treasure either in caves or deep under the ground for protection. The worst and most cruel of them would bury a prisoner on top, so the soul would guard the treasure, and most of the time, the prisoner wasn't killed before he was buried. Scientists also aren't actually sure if the prison burying would actually work to release the soul. There wasn't any evidence one way or the other. The rest would set up insanely elaborate traps to guard their treasure because it was so important to them. Almost every pirate had some form of gold buried somewhere hidden so they could come back to it later. Many people believed it was to hide it from pirates and the government so they wouldn't be caught. However, this isn't true. It's actually the opposite reason. Many people don't know about the government weren't fighting the pirates incredibly hard because they needed the gold. If the world ever fell low on gold and their money would start running out, the pirates would dig up their treasure and start buying things for cheaper, boosting up the world's economy. It was incredibly cruel that they had to keep doing it, and the government had to keep admitting to themselves that the pirates were helping the economy. The government would, of course, never tell the people of these deals. The people would just believe it and theorize about it. Some people would even ban pirates from shopping when gold went down, even though it would hurt them, because they really could have used it. However, others specifically needed the pirates. It was a cruel and unkind system, with the pirates existing depending which side you're on. Despite the deal with the government, they would still arrest and execute random pirates to keep up appearances. And the pirates actually understood that. One of the pirate quotes was, "There is no crime without law and order." So it was the natural system. However, both the government and the pirates were beginning to get worried. Because as time went on, the fishing people and cargo boats were beginning to change so they could be faster, making it harder for the pirates to take them down. And the government could hardly ask the people to stop improving the ships. People were also getting smarter, fitting their ships with their own cannons, and there were some records of cargo ships managing to lure pirate ships into natural traps. Then the pirates would be shot and killed, making piracy more difficult than it was worth. The pirates strangely seemed to think the government would help them with these problems. However, no, they wouldn't. The government were quickly giving up on them and were simply finding new ways to make money without them. And luckily, the people of Zarlum were happy to provide different ways. The pirates were quickly learning that the world was shrinking and moving forward without them. Many pirates went back to land and got normal jobs. Many stayed purely because of stubbornness, and a few simply just lived on the pirate island with all the money they had got from the pirating. One of the most rewarding and dangerous route a lot of pirates took was becoming explorers looking for either new land, new magic, or both. Most were looking for an ancient artifact known as the Fountain of Youth. But most people of Zarlum thought it was just a fairy tale told to young children before bed and nothing more. With the government now needing a new way to gain money due to the pirates being left behind by history, luckily the 12 island cities were happy to start providing other forms of income to the government. One of the biggest island cities was named DelRaven. The city was one of the most important because a lot of the world leaders liked to stay there and conduct their decisions of what should happen because of the fact the island city was the biggest and had the most amount of people. It would also be where some of the best inventions of the time were being created. Scientists had been working with proper science, unlike magic, because science was more conclusive and more controllable than the magic. So as the monks and pirates were working with magic, the scientists were also pushing forward. The progress was slow, and yet working. However, as DelRaven was becoming popular and moving the world forward, it became popular for all people around, including the monks of the fallen moon, who was still in control of the first great and bountiful Zarlum Empire, which had overtaken just over half of the mainland and was still seizing power across the globe. And they had set their sights on DelRaven. Their thinking was, if they overtook DelRaven, the rest would crumble like dominoes. So one day, the people of DelRaven were doing their normal routines when suddenly they felt fear, seemingly out of nowhere. It seemed a chill was falling over the city. The nights seemed darkness and more quiet, and the days were grey with thick fog that seemed to absorb everything within it. What the people of DelRaven did not yet realize this was simply the monks announcing their arrival. After a few weeks of this unnerving weather, boats came through the mist, docking themselves to the ports of Dirham, and the people were able to get their first glimpse of the monks of the fallen moon. The monks always wore black cloaks covering their entire bodies. They also wore black masks to cover their faces, so even the monks didn't know who each other were. If people were to try and remove the masks, they would only discover they were often stitched directly to the skin of the person wearing it. However, they wouldn't be able to have that fact for very long, for they would be killed seconds later. The monks were incredibly well trained in all forms of fighting and specialized in attacking very quickly with their swords to overwhelm their enemies. They were also trained to not feel pain, so it would be incredibly difficult to defeat the monks unless you'd cut their head off. And with some of the monks dealing with heavy magic, that horribly wouldn't always work in terms of killing them. The monks believed in their religion and took their gods incredibly seriously, to the point where they were willing to do anything the gods wanted. Zenith, who was hundreds upon hundreds of years old by this point, told his monks what the gods were saying, when in reality, the gods' will was actually his own will. But the monks believed him, and some even saw him as a god, and wanted to do anything they could to become master monks. To gain this title, they would have to go through incredibly intense mental training to help remove their emotions. This would allow them to be more enlightened. This also put them under a hypnotic state, allowing Zenith to tell them to do anything he asked of them. They'd also get rewards for doing so. One of the few ways to move up the ranks was to build and run a temple to help convert more and more to the mass religion. The temples were also perfect places to test if the monks were genuine. Many people tried to wear cloaks and masks to fool the monks so they could steal their things. However, the monks had considered this. Every time a monk would try to enter the tombs, the guards would stab them in the hand if the monk flinched from the pain. They would be executed instantly because they weren't real monks, so naturally had to be punished. This punishment wouldn't be given if the person wanted to join the monks, and if they were pretending and agreed, it would be a very bad idea. Once you agree to join the monks, the only way out is death. The monks were completely undead and unfeeling in almost every way. They heavily believed in the supernatural, and had definitely set a reputation for themselves over the many years. So when they arrived on the city of Dirham and said they wanted to set up a temple, the people didn't really argue because how could you possibly argue with the monks when they had slaughtered entire towns and villages for doing the same? The monks began building their temples and implemented a horrible rule that no other religion may exist while they occupied. So all other religions quickly had to leave Dirham, because if not, they were going to be killed. The monks gave people a terrifying piece of information that they were still stubborn enough not to admit. Ordinary people at the time thought creatures such as the kraken, mermaids, witches, and more importantly, vampires, weren't real. Of course, they were under their own delusion, and the monks were going to show them how wrong they really were. In the future, the Zerm people would study and come to an understanding of the creatures. But in those days, they were nothing but myth, and horribly, they were weapons. But they were in disbelief of what was right in front of them, because they couldn't comprehend the possibility of them being real, which was why it was so easy for those creatures to attack and hide from people. The monks were actually ahead of the scientists, having studied the creatures immensely, and they believed that the creatures were intelligent enough to be controlled and reasoned with. The monks told them if the creatures worked with them, they would no longer have to hide. They would simply be able to live their lives. All the creatures had to do was make sure the monks were in control, which, because most of the creatures were very scary and massively powerful, it wasn't entirely difficult. So the monks ruled over their empire with creatures and fear. But that's what they thought was effective, and had quite a lot of evidence for that. The true genius of the monks was their ability to control people's fear. That's why they toppled towns and villages, or make entire governments do exactly what they wanted by just speaking to them. Those creatures obviously meant a lot to the monks. The monks would actually be respectful and almost nice to them, treating them like pets. They used them to take control while believing they were gods. But they didn't want the gods to rule over them. They wanted to rule over the gods and use them as weapons against the people. Despite the fact that Zenith ruled half the mainland, and the plans were to start ruling the islands already having one of them, he was never going to be happy or satisfied until every single person on Zarlum was turned to their religion, and he ruled the entire world. He didn't care for things such as science. He wanted to get rid of it and make his magic the pure, unquestioned method. Many people who weren't monks had heard of Zenith's plan and thought he was crazy. But sanity had nothing to do with Zenith's plan, because he was capable of doing it and was not going to stop for anything. Over the many, many years, there had been a lot of groups that believed the same thing, that they should control the world, and everyone should believe in what they believe. However, they all fell simply because of the fact they didn't have anywhere near the power the monks had, and the numbers there were simply just too many of them. The monks were in Dirham. However, they had a problem. The government had given them control, but the people had decided they didn't want them there, and they were not allowed to build there, so the temple they wanted wasn't possible. Zenith determined that to turn Dirham into their temple from the surface was impossible, because the people would just fight them off. So they did the next best thing. They created tunnels and massive tombs under the ground, going miles and miles deep into their tomb, where they kept their religious texts and weapons. When the tunnels were finished, they started going from city to city, slaughtering everyone with their swords, and making their marks on the world. They didn't even need to use the creatures to strike fear into the hearts of people anymore, because they were scary enough. But it helped. When they had slaughtered everyone in the cities that didn't conform to their religion, they would bring the bodies to their tombs and form tunnels lining them with skulls, creating the mighty catacombs under Dirham City, full of mass burial sites, and were designed to make people panic and get lost, so they could add to their mighty numbers. The monks were going to kill anyone that they saw as impure, which was basically everyone on Zarlum that wasn't with them. They killed almost 60% of everyone on the planet at the time. They mostly targeted people who believed in other religions. They rarely ever killed people with no religion at all, because they knew their fear would make them change, and if they didn't change, they wouldn't be seen and impure by the monks' gods. And because of propaganda, no one wanted to be seen as impure, and they would be criticized by society. The monks cursed themselves, so they couldn't die without the spell being broken. And that was a very difficult thing to accomplish. Because of that, the monks ruled over the land, and like Zenith predicted, when Dirham was owned by the monks, the rest of the island cities fell one by one, each one easier than the last. The moment that happened, the monks continued expanding. Despite the monks practically owning the entire planet, Zenith still wasn't satisfied. He wanted them to not just be in every country, but to have temples on every area. After enough time, that would be doable. What wasn't so doable was his ultimate goal. Zenith's view of a perfect world was every single person believing in their religion and doing anything and everything he asked. However, most people just simply wouldn't believe in him, no matter what they did to them. They needed something to make people terrified, and luckily it was on their way. From an unexpected place, even the monks couldn't have predicted what was going to happen. About 500 years after the monks' world takeover, the monks were still looking for something to give people fear. Zenith was even working on improving his magic to try and give someone a horrible curse that would scare people into non-stop, terrified belief. However, amazingly, he didn't need to, because the world had the most unexpected visitor. 4 of them, in fact. A strange-looking egg-like spaceship landed on the planet. It seemed to have technology far superior to what Zarlum would ever be capable of, because their small ship was somehow bigger on the inside, almost like a TARDIS. However, it was a little more complicated why it was able to work. When the ship landed, the monks went over to inspect it, Zenith being among them. When they viewed the egg, even they started feeling fear because of what stepped out.
What stepped out of the spaceship were 4 strange-looking women, all of which had enormous different-colored wings, almost like angels.
Records differ depending on who you ask about what the creatures said, but most people can agree they essentially informed the monks they had increased their technology and now wanted to explore and see what different worlds were like. However, the monks decided to use the entire situation against not just the new creatures, but the people at the same time. The monks didn't have to do a lot. All they had to do was inform the people that the creatures were there to destroy them and take the planet for themselves. This is why the records are differed, because it was very possible that the creatures really did say that, and the monks simply informed the people. But no one really knew, because it was so long ago, and record-keeping wasn't very reliable back then.
When the monks told the people that all they had to do was let what happened happen, the people immediately started going after the creatures, believing them to be monsters. And it wasn't helped by the fact that one of the creatures just so happened to be named Lucifer and had the ability to shoot fire and do some incredible things with fire, using it to defend herself and the people who were her sisters. She didn't want to kill anyone, but the monks had cultivated a situation which forced her to start killing. She wasn't actually the devil, however people really thought she was, not even from the name and the fire, but also from the fact she was wearing all black clothes, had black raven-like wings, and was the only one out of the group who had large black curly horns sticking out the top of her head. However, unlike the devil, she was the only creature that tried to calm everyone down and didn't use her abilities until she had to use them to defend herself from a town. She blew up a building, not realizing it was full of gunpowder. The resulting explosion and fire nearly destroyed the entire town. Lucifer genuinely wasn't trying to destroy it. It just kind of happened. After that, they had no other choice than to get back into their ships and fly back into space. And even that was difficult, because the monks had taken their ship. By that point, the bird women were desperate to get back to safety. So they used their abilities against the monks to get their ship back and quickly flee to the skies. The 4 bird women had no idea how much they had changed the world by doing that little friendly visit. The monks were able to convince the people that it was them that brought those creatures down, and they would do it again if the people didn't do what they said. More horrible creatures would come down. They said how the bird women were simply just a taste of what the monks were going to bring. This, of course, was a massive lie, but of course the people just didn't know that, so most of them agreed. This was also the very beginning building blocks to another religion. Christianity, if the leader of the group wasn't called Lucifer. Maybe things could have turned out different, but no. People believed that God sent her to beat some of his wisdom into them forcefully, despite the fact it had nothing to do with it. They were just aliens trying to explore their universe. This was, however, only the beginning blocks. Soon the baby Jesus would be born, and the rest of Christianity would take place. However, we're not going to focus on that at this moment, because the monks were getting themselves busy. Strangely, the visit of these weird aliens would someday become nothing but stories no one would be able to tell if they were true or not, and that would greatly affect the future. This was mostly due to the records, so people would just assume they were stories. Also, as a result of the aliens' visits, the aliens themselves had a great distrust for Zarlum, which was understandable, but that wouldn't be very helpful for the future.
After this visit, the monks started using the horror of the people's belief against them, which was one of their specialties. They were excellent at it. The monks told people if they weren't going to get in line, they would bring terrifying creatures alive to kill them. And because of Zenith having worked with his magic, that wasn't a threat that was in every way real. They weren't going to bring creatures down from space they didn't really need to. However, Zenith still wanted to make sure that whatever it was that he created wasn't ever going to die. Meanwhile, certain rich members of the world's society began to notice, because of the monks' restrictions, they were unable to spend their money how they wished, and unable to have the freedom they believed they were entitled to. So naturally, as the monks worked on and controlled the world even further, those members of society began to make moves against them from the shadows, because they knew that the monks could no longer be the strongest people on the planet. After a few years of life going on and everyone being fairly miserable because of the monks, people decided to try and focus on something that wasn't horrible. The Zerm began to see the planet of Zarlum not just as a place to live on, but as a resource to be harvested for the greater good of the people. So they began setting up massive mines, using extremely powerful machinery to dig deep into the planet to discover new, amazing metals that couldn't even be found on Earth. The little amount of scientists and inventors who were still operational were fascinated by the metals and started working on different ways to use them. The metals allowed them to begin creating cars, weapons, and even buildings, improving their cities massively. They were far more advanced than humans were at the same time in their history. Zarlum, at this point, had a rather large problem with the ever-growing society, and that was the fact there were no leaders to shape the land into what it would one day become. There were presidents and kings, however. With the monks and the creatures, it was difficult for them to be taken seriously because they couldn't do anything with the monks constantly telling them what to do, and they rarely, if ever, worked together on anything from distrust. So things had to change, or they were never going to be able to move in the right direction, or any direction at all. Multiple people on Zarlum were beginning to recognize that a world where the monks were in control, they had absolutely nothing. The world simply wouldn't move, so they simply had to go. This is usually where I would end a part with, luckily, a solution was about to come along. However, a solution was on its way, but luck had absolutely nothing to do with it. End of Episode 2, Part 5.